Hi, I'm Minister Krista Logan, and this is the Brazil Missions Trip 2024.
I was so excited to go with my sisters from Divine, and we partnered with Shalom Outreach, Inc., as well as Mount Gilead Full Gospel International Ministries, and we were just so excited to be on this trip. The theme of this trip was Power Surge. And oh boy, did God show up and show out with the power.
This was my first mission trip international. I was able to get the opportunity to go to Brazil and experience something I have never even seen before, something new, something that is going to be greater than my imagination.
We went to several different places in the community. We went to the favelas, which are kind of like the low income. It's nothing in comparison to the United States. It's the lower than low where people, they actually have to live outside and make their welfare and their well-being just outside in nature in the city. We also went to other rural areas such as substance abuse treatment centers. I do want to talk about the first encounter on our day one, and that was going to a substance abuse treatment center called Gethsemane. And this was a substance abuse treatment center for men only. It was voluntary, meaning that those that were there, they willingly came in for treatment. They typically stayed for about 90 days or more. It actually started with about 50 people. The owner started with 50 people, but God told him that he needed to downsize so that he could focus one-on-one more with the ministry. And there they dealt with the physical man, and then they also dealt with the spiritual side. So they had a place for the men to work, they had a place for the men to farm and have agriculture, then they had a place for the men to worship and to cultivate their inner man and their spiritual being. When we were there at Gethsemane, it was absolutely electrifying. We were in a building, a small room. There was no equipment, there was no studio lights, there was no sound technician. It was just the people and God. And we were able to sing songs, to sing melodies in both languages. They speak Portuguese in Brazil. So we sang in Portuguese, we sang in English. There were times where we made melody unto the Lord together in both languages at the very same time. And I will never forget the sound. God moves by movement, and then there's also a sound when it's true and authentic worship.
So we were on our way to our third halfway house when God diverted us. He told us that we were gonna actually be going to the favelas that day. Some of us were a little hesitant because, again, we have never been there before, but thankfully we partnered with SIPA Church and they went with us, and the pastor took us in, and he had a relationship with them where they handed out food and drinks to the people, so we were able to get in. Now, the favelas is not something that you can just go to. You have to have access and you have to have an okay from the people higher up in that community. So we thank God for the opening and the gate and the entrance that was open for us to come in, because there were divine assignments and divine encounters at the favela. One example is we prayed for people that were dealing with addiction. There was a young boy, 11 years old, named David. And the Lord told me to ask, David, are you saved? David said he was not saved and he wanted to be saved. We prayed a prayer of salvation. David, at 11 years old, he gave his life to Christ that day.
We were also able to experience another halfway house, and this is another substance abuse treatment center. But on this one, this was an involuntary. Like some of the students that was there, they did not want to be there. They were either there against their will or their family just kind of forced them in. And so it really gave us the opportunity to see, how they were feeling. You also had mental health in there, bipolar, schizophrenia. You had the different things that people deal with in this particular facility. But we were able to go in there with such power, with such grace, with such favor, to be able to minister to them right where they were. And we were able to sing to them and praise and worship with them. And also the different men from Mount Gilead Full Gospel International Ministries was able to pray over them and be able to relate and speak a word into their life, to speak a word of encouragement, to speak a word to know that they can make it out of that facility, even if it's against their will, even if they did not want to be there. And those different individuals, those men came up and received. So even though they didn't have a willingness, they had a willingness at that service to be set free, to be released, to be even if they felt captive, they was able to be set free and released and delivered. And that just really, really warmed my heart.
The blessing in this missions trip was not just for the people in the community, but it was also for the leadership that God had established in the ministries in Brazil. We went to one ministry called Vida Nova, where there was an apostle who had been up in this manner for maybe 20 or more years serving. He has over 300 churches. About a month before we arrived in Brazil, he lost his wife who was actually the foundation of the ministry. And he had decided that it was going to be his end and that he was no longer going to push the ministry and to build any further. When we came to his ministry on that night, the Pastor Julian, who was leading us in missions, he preached Joshua 1 and talked about Moses, my servant is dead. From that point on, the pastor was able to impart in him and to encourage him to keep going forth because God would be with him. He stood on that stage that night speechless, and he came to us at the end of the night and stated that he was going to give up, but because we had come, he was able to hear the voice of the Lord on that night, and he decided that very night he was going back out into the ministries and he was going to continue apostling and continue the work that God had given him. Another ministry we went to was SEPA. And before we left on that night, the entire row was taken up by the leaders of that church. Pastor Julian was able to lay hands along with other ministers, and we were able to impart and empower in them to continue in the work and the ministry that God had given them for the communities that they would serve. So it was not only about the people, but it was also about the power surge and empowering leadership so that we can continue discipling and kingdom work.
At the end of the Kingdom Advance Conference, it was 2 days. We had the opportunity to pray for the people, the congregants, and as well as our interpreters. And one thing that stood out for me is we were able to bless our interpreters with the oils and the handkerchiefs that came from Divine World Changers International Ministries that have been at the altar, prayed over by our leaders. And one of the interpreters said that her mother was dealing with mental health issues, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations. And she took that handkerchief and said she was going to put it underneath her mother's pillow. So we thank God for the anointing. The same anointing that rests in this house is in Brazil. We thank you, pastors. We thank you, Divine, for your tithes and offerings. And we thank you, Shalom. And we just say thank you, because without you, we could not have done this.
Just want to say thank you, Divine World Changers International Ministry, Pastor Derwin Hickman, Senior, and Co-Pastor Francois Hickman, for being able to send me on a debt-free mission to do God's work. I am Isaiah 61, and I will continue to serve in greater heights.